Well, welcome, Jack. I'm sorry Judy couldn't join us, but how lucky for me.
Well, it's great to be with you today, Liz.
So for those of you who don't know, I think Jack has been, I think you win as the individual who has been at more USGLC conferences. We were lucky enough that you came when you were Deputy Secretary of State, Chief of Staff at the White House, Secretary at the Treasurer. How's private life?
I'm just here as a citizen, the highest office according to Thomas Jefferson.
You're enjoying yourself?
I am.
It's great. It's great. Well, when we had to figure out how to explain the connection between development, diplomacy, and the American economy, I knew to call the person who understood it the best. So let me start with this. You know, the fundamental point of the report that Sarah just mentioned is to examine the return on investment from America's global engagement in the world, kind of the what's in it for us. And I couldn't help but notice when I watched the election, like all of us, that there was a lot of tension in that question. That I would watch headlines that said voters are skeptical about global engagement, voters are skeptical about trade, they're skeptical about aid, particularly in the heartland and rural America. So start with the fundamentals. How do you make the connection about what is in it for us? There's a lot of business leaders. I've been talking with them. I know a lot of these folks. But help us, give us the language. America, global engagement, what's in it for us?
So, you know, Liz, I think there's multiple arguments that make the case that it's in our interest. It's not just something we're doing out of the goodness of our heart. I don't care if you're in the agriculture industry or manufacturing airplanes or making machine parts. The demand for your goods outside of the United States is the future because that's where demand is growing. The United States has to be engaged in the world, has to have a market for its goods and services, and if we don't engage, others will. And others will develop the relationships, others will get there first, others will start to squeeze out American competitors. So just at a very basic level, we want to develop markets for American goods and services. Now, I think that you can go to the next level, which is, and picking up on the themes of the last panel, a more secure world grows better. Yeah. A more secure world has more ability to feed more mouths. That means buying more food and buying more seed corn and buying more airplanes and buying more engines and all the things that go along with all that. And we also, if we can concentrate on the commercial relationships, don't have to be engaged in as much damage control around the world, which is very expensive and takes away from other things we could be investing in. You know, third, we have values that underlie our economy that are very important to us. We use our engagement in the international economy to spread those values. Now, we are going to do things, I hope, like protect our environment and protect our workers and all the things that make this a wonderful country. If other people don't do those things, then it's going to make it more expensive to make American products. Now, the answer isn't for us to create unsafe workplaces. The answer is for others to raise their standards. And I think that the reaction against trade agreements is exactly wrong. Because a world without trade agreements is a world where others go in a race to the bottom, and unless we follow them, we're going to become less competitive. We need to pull others up, because when we pull others up to our standard, we're going to be able to sell more things in the world. Now, I think you don't have to get to all of the self-interest economically, because I can justify why we ought to be engaged in the world for a dozen other reasons, starting with our values and going to our security. But if you don't care about those things and you just want to look at it through the lens of our economic well-being, the future is going to be a lot less bright for American workers if we withdraw from the world, because the world will start to close down to us.
I want to come back to the, excuse me, sorry, that's so loud when I cough. Let me ask you a question about this. You have been in the private sector, you've been in the public sector, and I want to ask you about an argument I hear often, which is why doesn't the private sector just do it all? And I think about a couple of things that you just said that I want to come back to, but particularly about this question, why doesn't the private sector just do it? And there are some things that only government is going to do. You just kind of hit on a few of those points. We talk a lot at the USGLC about ending extreme poverty. In just a few years, 50% of those in extreme poverty are going to be living in conflict and fragile states. And so there are some things that only government is going to be able to do to address those issues. Rule of law, fighting corruption. Can you help us with that? Because it is one of the biggest comments I always hear about.
Well, if you take the elements of what it takes to create stability and a better future in the most troubled parts of the world, it comes down to things like having food, education, and healthcare. Now, when we help a country to feed its people, we're also selling them things or giving them things, but we're creating a market for American products. Every health clinic that we've given money to around the world uses a lot of supplies. Those supplies are coming from somewhere. So we're doing something good on its own. I mean, ending poverty and ending terrible diseases that kill young babies and their mothers, you shouldn't have to defend that in economic terms.
That is true.
But on the other side, it has an economic advantage, and that's nothing new. I mean, we were talking before, on the 70th anniversary of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was one of the most far-sighted, generous things that a country has ever done. And it happened to be pretty good business. It created both the ability for countries that were ravaged by war to have money to spend, and it created a market for America to sell products. And it had a lot to do with creating the magic of the 1950s in the United States. Now, I don't think the fact that it was in our interest makes it any less noble. We did the right thing for the right reason, but it was enlightened self-interest as well. And I think that that is true about a lot of these other programs. And it feels a little tawdry to talk about saving the lives of babies as being good for business. But if you do the wrong thing and say it's not our problem to worry about the poor children in the world, that's a lot less goods and services as well. So you're shutting down the flow. And then you end up with an unstable, continent which is creating extremism that we have to then deal with through defense mechanisms that are much more expensive and much less likely to succeed.
I have to say, I have heard the Marshall Plan, everybody talks about the Marshall Plan over and over again in national security arena. It is so rare to hear somebody talk about the benefits of the Marshall Plan from an economic point of view. It's a fascinating...
Well, we had the only currency in the world, we had the only manufacturing capacity in the world, and most of our trading partners had neither money nor goods.
It's a great argument, so we can talk about that tomorrow. Let me ask you something. In your opening comments, you talked about others will fill the void if we step out. In the last conversation, we heard it from the national security point of view, but I want to talk about it from an economic point of view. I remember the first time I went to Ethiopia, I brought a group of advisors, of the political advisors that were going to run different presidential campaigns. And to be honest, some of them were quite skeptical about the whole idea of should we be giving development and diplomacy, should we be engaging in the international affairs budget, and should we be even helping in Africa? We get to the Addis Ababa airport, we're going to the Sheraton Hotel, you've been there, it's about a 15-minute drive, and in that drive, you probably can imagine where I'm going with the story if you've been there, you pass the train who is developing it, the Chinese. Right. And one of my guests said, oh my goodness, the Chinese are eating our lunch. And I really felt almost we could turn the little, the cab that we're in around and get back on the plane and say the job is done, they get it. Right. And my question for you is, what is the economic competitive issue in terms of it? There is this proposal, I opened the conference by talking about the cuts. One of the proposals that is on is to close and shutter 35 USAID missions. 11 of those are slated, I don't know if they'll happen, but 11 of them are slated to be in Latin America alone. So give us a sense, you served as the Treasury of this country, the Secretary of Treasury. what would that actually mean?
So I don't think China's interest in playing an international role is limited to Africa. I think they look to Latin America, and they look to all the countries of the world that they want to have trade relationships with and have ultimately security relationships with. I don't think China has traditionally approached its international economic assistance anywhere near the way we have. And that's beginning to change, but the history is it was purely an economic transaction where it was in China's self-interest. It didn't have a great track record in terms of creating great relations around the world. There was a lot of discord where China was not using local workers, where they were leaving some unsupportable, unsustainable financing problems where the payments went to China. That's beginning to change with the new One Belt, One Road initiative, but it's not completely changing. China's on an arc, on a trajectory. When I started as Deputy Secretary of State, you could not have a conversation with the Chinese about development assistance because they didn't do development assistance.
That's a good point.
And as Secretary of the Treasury, we were able to collaborate and work jointly on development projects.
So that was in a, what, about a
that was
4 or 5
7
year,
yeah, 5 year period.
5 year period that changed.
And if we now withdraw from the space where we're providing development assistance, China's at a different place than it was 10 years ago. They're going to fill that space, and they'll create goodwill as well as commercial relationship. Now, that's not a bad thing if they do it in the right way. My beef with China is not that they are doing these things, it's that they need to do it in a way that supports strong standards. They can't leave behind the kind of environmental problems that they have. They can't ignore local sustainability and labor issues. I think they know they have to move in that direction, but they don't have to move as far in that direction if we're not pressing. So the world will not be a better place if we step out and China steps in. China will do better if we're in there competing with them. China will have higher standards. In the end of the day, it is not good for the United States to not be a presence in Africa, in Asia, in our home hemisphere. And I think the short-sightedness of pulling development assistance out is of generational consequence, because we came out of the Cold War, where there was talk of ugly Americans, and development assistance was not. It was the antidote. It was the sacks of food. It was the medical care. It was speaking for why you want to be partners with the United States. And I think if we withdraw and others take that space, they will see benefits that become not just economic, but strategic and security related as well. I don't think development assistance has always been done perfectly, so we have to always try to do it better, more efficiently, more effectively. And I think you have to distinguish between how do you engineer it to do it well, from do you shut down operations in Latin America? Do you withdraw major funding for health care? I mean, the Bush administration, with the PEPFAR program, put America back on the map in Africa as caring about the people suffering from AIDS in Africa. That mantle was picked up and expanded to be not just dealing with the AIDS crisis, but dealing with infectious disease. We would not have been in a position to respond to the Ebola crisis if we didn't have the infrastructure in place from those things. Now, you want to talk about a real fear in a global world that is smaller and smaller? Infectious diseases that you have no ability to deal with. The only country in the world that has had the capacity to intervene effectively is the United States. We've worked hard over the last 5 years to get others to be our partners, to get the World Bank and the IMF to be deeply involved in playing a leadership role. But it will be very real to Americans if those kinds of diseases can't be contained quickly and they start coming home.
So let me ask you about that last one. So one of the questions that I hear a lot, I don't know if the rest of you hear about it, and we're going to take questions from the audience soon, but I want to ask you this. You mentioned the IMF. You mentioned the World Bank. the idea of multilateral engagement, for some, is not that popular. And yet for others, understand that it's a leverage. We put $1 in, we can leverage $7 more for what we do. Help understand, what are we leveraging, or are we actually giving up our power? You dealt a lot with that in your years.
I don't think we give up anything for our engagement in these multilateral ventures, because we're the leader in these organizations. And if we want the world to have an emergency crisis response program, we kind of work hard, and the World Bank creates an emergency crisis response program. We think it's important for the IMF to create an economic safety net for Ukraine so that Russia's aggression can't lead to the collapse of the Ukrainian economy. The IMF comes in with almost $20 billion of assistance when we're providing $1 billion. I mean, you talk about leverage. If we didn't have those institutions and we wanted to address those problems, I don't think we have the ability to write checks large enough on our own. Now, we have the position we have in those organizations because for 70 years we've provided the intellectual and moral leadership, and at the beginning we provided an awful lot of the money. But now we're not, when we struggled for years to get IMF quota reform done, we weren't putting new money in. We were moving money from one pocket to another pocket. Other countries were putting new money in. It still took us 5 years to get it through Congress.
Yes, you worked very hard on that. I remember it well.
And the world knows the United States will not be putting in the lion's share of new money because after we've seen billions of people brought out of poverty, other countries have the ability and the desire to participate and to put in their share and to have a stronger voice at the table. So I actually think that we've helped create a world where others can take more responsibility. The question is, do we play a role in that where we can still make sure that those organizations promote our values and our interests? I think that's very important to the United States.
So 2 more questions before I open it up. You mentioned about reform, and I want to ask you this. When at the tail end that you were at State Department, you helped launch, and then it was continued, develop this idea of economic statecraft, this idea of kind of leveraging private sector engagement. And it's been interesting to watch this idea of making sure that if we were sitting here 30, 40 years ago, we would be looking at a world where the flow of capital to the developing world was largely coming from government. And today it's about 10%. That government's kind of a small player in it. And what the State Department was trying to do is and I think has been doing with Power Africa, with Feed the Future, with some of these programs, is to really leverage this government funding to try to really create impact and scale of private sector engagement. When you look back, did it work? Is it working? What do we need to do to get that real reform? Because I think that's what this administration, we're going to have your successor, John Sullivan, the Deputy Secretary of State, is going to come by. What would you tell him still needs to be done in terms of reform? How do we get it right?
Look, I think that the challenges are many. You're dealing in countries where doing business is not easy. So there are many countries where just to navigate the bureaucracy runs the risk of delays or demands that an independent party without some assistance from the government can't contend with. Now, if you can navigate that, you can create small power producers in Africa where privately owned facilities can get financed and generate power to meet Africa's needs, and American companies can be doing very attractive business. You can go around the world and come up with examples in energy, in food, in other areas. I think that one of the things the government can do, it has done, is provide some political risk insurance. If you want to do business as an individual business or an individual, you can't necessarily undertake the geopolitical risk when it's quite clear and apparent. That's something government can help with. when other countries are offering subsidies to have their products be more competitive. In the best of all possible worlds, we would have no government subsidies and everything would be completely on a market basis. But it's kind of short-sighted to say the only companies that might not have that benefit are American companies. So things like the Export-Import Bank are very important. Right. You can level the playing field in two ways. You can do what other people do, you can get everybody to stop doing it. What you can't do is be the one country that doesn't offer export financing when you want to sell your airplanes and your power plants and your farm equipment.
So my last question before I open it up for Q&A is, how many people in your congressional districts and states saw in some of your local congressional races some tension politically on trade, foreign policy, globalization, something that you saw some tension? Raise your hand. A lot of you. So my question for you is, politically, we were talking about it earlier, help us, how would you respond to that tension we saw in the election on trade, on global engagement, politically?
I think it's undeniable that there is anxiety in the United States and pretty much around the world about the impact of globalization on domestic workforces, on domestic demographics. The movement of people is an issue that's been profound in European and Middle Eastern countries as well as here.
All over the world.
Actually, more so there than here.
Yeah.
As I look at the anxiety and even the anger in America's electorate, I see two things that are coming together but being combined, and they need to be separated. One is the impact of technology, and the other is the impact of globalization and trade. I think that if you start to look at what the manufacturing workplace looks like in the United States, it is almost undeniable that technology, more than trade, is what is causing the anxiety about the future of what does the workplace look like. As Treasury Secretary, I visited dozens of factories, and it became very clear that these didn't look like factories did 10 years ago. You would see these immaculate floors with virtually no people, with machines that were being run by sophisticated and custom software, doing things that used to have lines of people doing. And ironically, the United States is increasing its manufacturing output because of that.
Right.
Because once the labor input is reduced, the United States becomes a much more competitive place to manufacture. But that's not trade. That is technology. Now, trade, I don't know if it's 10%, 20%, 30%. It is not 40%. I think it's probably less than a quarter of what the change in manufacturing looks like. People are doing studies on it. None of them are terribly convincing yet. But it is almost obvious from looking at the workplace that it's technology. Now, I think the answer to that is not to cut yourself off from the world where the demand for the things that you manufacture is growing. The answer is, how do you have an economy that works for working people so they can have jobs and their kids can have jobs that support a middle-class lifestyle? For people who are currently working, it's a little hard to imagine somebody my age or myself becoming a software engineer. That's not likely to happen to somebody who's in the back end of their career, not the front end. But that doesn't mean there's no work they can do. In a country that has airports and seaports and bridges and tunnels that haven't gotten the investment they need in 25 years, we have a lot of work to do in this country if we could put our resources to work to build a better, stronger economic base for the future. For our kids, we have to make sure that the education they get gives them the skills they need to have what it takes to add value in the modern economy. And frankly, our schools are not up to snuff everywhere. And the answer to that isn't by taking resources away from them. The answer is to figure out how to do it well and give them the resources, and we know how to do it. We have the best system of secondary and post-secondary education in the world for people who get the benefit of it. We have to make sure more people get the benefit of it. And we do have to fix something that's broken in our economy in terms of the uneven distribution of income and wealth. But none of that is something we can blame on our competitors. That's because we have a broken tax code that we can't get the political will to fix. It's because we tolerate the weakening of the bargaining position of workers, and we need to make sure workers can stand up for themselves, particularly in a tightening labor market. Those are not problems that were created by our competitors. And so I think we have to separate what do we need to do. When I go to international conferences, the thing that strikes me is that if each of us solved the problems in our own borders, we collectively would all be a lot better off. And if we're not going to get there by
pointing the fingers at each other. There's a lot of tension. Well, great, wonderful. Let's open up for questions. There's 2 microphones. You have to come to the microphone so we can hear you if you wouldn't mind. Couple ground rules is no speeches, so we can get to as many as we can. Just introduce yourself, and we've got about 20 minutes, I think. Please.
I'm Rob Rowan with Global Action Coalition, and in Djibouti, we see the Chinese getting involved, and we see us backing away. It's a country, it's a moderate Muslim country, as you know, many might not know much about Djibouti, but it has big issues with Somalians coming in, Yemeni come in, Ethiopians come in. As an NGO person, I wonder, how do you see a way for there to be an open way for us to be able to help fill that gap that the U.S. government is backing away from, so that we can help balance that out, partner with the military, partner with organizations?
Why don't I take one, since there's so many lined up, why don't we just take 2, and Jack, you can get them both if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Liu and Ms. Schrayer. My name is Travis Haggard from Wichita Falls, Texas. I do economic development, business retention, and expansion profession. So thank you for addressing global economic development.
Right.
I had a question. Recently, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said that we can no longer fully count on others. And so all I can say is that we Europeans must really take our destiny into our own hands. I think it was pretty apparent that she was pointing at the trust factor with the U.S. My question to that is, given the challenges facing America's perception, the image overseas today, how important is it for the U.S. to maintain its commitments and institutions and global economic systems that we have already helped put into place?
Okay, 2 tough questions.
So look, I think there are actually 2 questions with the same answer, and I can't speak to Djibouti specifically, but generally, I mean, what Chancellor Merkel was saying was that for the last 70 years, the world has relied on the United States to be the foundation and the backbone of a system where we work together to promote strong economies and strong values and common security. I don't think there's a country in Europe that less wants the United States to diminish in its role there than Germany. And I think it is profoundly in America's interest for there to be no question about the reliability, not just last year and this year, but next year and for the future of America's being there. But I think that's also the answer to the question on Djibouti. One year we might get to one country, another year we might get to another country. If the idea is that our goal is to help our partners and to provide development assistance to meet the needs, then we will be seen as a trustworthy partner. If we just pull up our tents and withdraw, I worry that, and the last panel spoke to this at some length, I really worry what the world looks like in 10 years or 20 years if countries get the idea that you can't count on the United States, because the world won't stay put. We've had alliances, whether it's with Germany or Australia, with countries in Latin America or Africa, where for decades and decades it's been based on the fact that they can count on us being there when they need us. In the military and security arena, it's mutual defense agreements. In the economic space, it's we're there with development assistance, or we're there to be partners when there are needs that need to be addressed. That doesn't mean we can pay the bill for everyone, nor should we. There has to be fair burden sharing in a world where incomes have been growing. And that, I was talking about the international financial institutions. It is totally appropriate that the United States not bear the full burden on its own just because we were the architects of the system 70 years ago. But it's equally important that we in the United States ought to want to preserve our special role and not to abandon that, because with abandoning that, countries will look elsewhere for leadership. And that's going to hurt us both in terms of our economy and national security if we allow that to happen.
Great question.
Thank you.
Please.
John Gonzalez from Dallas, Texas. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service. If expanding markets in trade and investment is critical to a growing U.S. economy, why has this issue become so contentious in recent years? Is it just politics? When did it start?
Okay, good question.
Good afternoon. My name is Kip Shirotis. I'm from Denver, Colorado. Your question about conflict, tension in trade policy I witnessed in Colorado during the election. It was generational. It was the older generation that was the most fearful because they're going to lose their job, they won't be able to get a new one, and they waste away in retirement. It's not called Social Security for nothing. So my question is, what are the mitigation? What are the mitigating elements? What can you do for that older generation?
Well, those go together too.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything new about this being hard in the United States. You know, the history of whether it was the United States staying out of the League of Nations or it being a struggle to pass Bretton Woods, it's always been hard. And it's always taken bipartisan cooperation, bringing together of interests from different parts of the country, just like this room reflects, you know, where it's, you know, the agricultural heartland, it's the industrial heartland, it's the intellectual leaders of the universities around the country, and people in diplomacy. So I think it's hard because, you know, it's never popular to write checks, you know, unless you're writing it to the person you're with. Everybody says, why do we need to pay for that? Why do we need to do that? But the case has, for the last 70 years, been made successfully. How you provide a transition for older workers who are displaced is really hard. And you have to start by being empathetic and understand that it is not by their own fault that people who are, you know, 45, 50, 55, 60, whose work no longer is going to provide them the income that they had relied on, are in a really hard place in life, and you can't treat them as if they've done something wrong. Now, there are ways to retrain people, which I'll say candidly, we've not been that great at in this country. I mean, we've done it well in places, but I think it's really important, not just when you're trying to pass a trade agreement, but when there's no trade agreement on the table, to show through our actions that if there are skills people need, we can take, whether it's our community colleges or, you know, an in-service program, and help people to acquire the skills they need. Realistically, I think you can't pretend that somebody who, I mean, I'll use myself as an example. I could not become a software engineer. I just couldn't. You know, I mean, a lot of things that I know I can do really well, that's not something I have the facility for, and I'm not sure my mind is plastic enough for me to pick that up. But that doesn't mean I can't learn other things. And depending on what your work was, we have to help people with that.
Great, thank you. Please.
Thank you. I'm Rachel Carrillo from Colorado. I'm a digital diplomat and a global citizen. I would love to be paid for both, but I'm one of those displaced workers, I guess. So I create a job for myself, and it's within this global context of the collaborative economy. So I'm wondering if you could speak to what's happening with the innovations that are born here in the U.S. that reach out across the globe. In my view, like Airbnb is pretty tied into a form of cultural diplomacy where people are sharing space and sharing homes. And groups like Couchsurfing and, of course, Uber and Lyft. If you could speak to how that is impacting the global economy and how that may be bringing jobs to displaced people, youth among them.
I'm going to cut you off only
Okay.
because I'm getting the sign and I see how many people are there. So we have a question on innovation. I'm going to grab this one right behind you. Quick question.
Yes, sir, Mr. Secretary. Edie Willard from South Carolina. In this room, we are a group of people who understand the importance of the international budget through an experience that we've had. I remember from my economics courses that there's not much in the money supply equation that talks about, that shows global investment. Can you tell us if there's something in your background or your experience that brings you to this aspect that you believe that it's important to be involved globally? What have you experienced?
Hold up on that one. And this last comment, and I'll apologize to anyone I'm missing.
Hi,
Make it really good.
my name's Tim Deal from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I'm a veteran, and I'd like to find out, the One Belt, One Road initiative is very much in the news, especially if you follow Asia. How do you see the best path forward for America to partner with China to increase our level of cooperation with them and to possibly even benefit economically once they get it really spun up and running?
All right, so if Jack, because of time, if you could do, kind of the lightning round on China, on innovation, and then close with a personal comment of what's motivating you, because I've known you, we've known each other a long time, and as I said, you're my go-to guy, and what motivates you to care so deeply about this, because I know you do?
So on China, China's creation of new international arenas through the One Belt, One Road initiative, through the Asia Infrastructure Bank, has created some tensions in terms of how you think about U.S. policy. I don't think we should think of China as a threat that has to be resisted. But we do have to think about how do you encourage China to do things in the right way, in a constructive way. And we engaged with China over the Asia Infrastructure Bank, and it was sometimes testier than, frankly, it was intended to be. Our goal all along was to get them to subscribe to higher standards, to subscribe to the kinds of standards that govern decision-making in the existing international financial institutions, understanding they were going to have their own process and their own system. I actually think that we largely succeeded in that because they have embraced those standards, they have partnered with the international financial institutions, and they have not yet done projects completely on their own. And as they move on to projects on their own, their objective is to meet those standards. Now, whether we join or not, that's a role the United States has to, I think, continue to play, to press on China having those standards. By cooperating with China, and we do that through the international financial institutions, I think we create an opportunity for American businesses to be part of those undertakings. I think anyone who would suggest that we ought to subscribe and buy a share of the Asia Infrastructure Bank would probably meet with a little bit of an obstacle on one end or the other of Pennsylvania Avenue, if not both. But that doesn't mean that we can't play a constructive role, and sometimes it's by pushing, and it's by insisting on standards.
What about innovation?
Innovation is a two-edged sword. I think we have been the source of innovation that has driven not just the U.S. economy, but the global economy, and we see how quickly it gets picked up and the people-to-people engagement that it leads to. As I've traveled around the world as secretary, I also got a sense that there was a fear of kind of U.S. Taking over things in other countries because everything was being dominated by U.S. technology. And some of that is jealousy, that's, we're doing better than they are. Some of it is fear of what's the back door and is there loss of control. And I think we have to be sensitive to those issues in a world where privacy is a paramount concern and where country relations, national relations, as well as business relations are seen in some of these technologies. What I think is undeniable is that the world counts on us being
An innovator.
that laboratory of innovation, because we have both the intellectual capacity, the entrepreneurial spirit, the business environment, the rule of law that just creates the magic that makes it work. But it's not purely admiration, and I think we have to...
There's a tension there.
There's a tension there, and we can't ignore that because it's very much perceived. On the other question about why is it good, a growing world economy is not just good for the other parts of the world that are growing, it's good for us. It creates a safer world, it creates markets for us to be active in, and it reduces the likelihood of conflict, which I think is pretty important because we saw from World War I to World War II a terrible period in the West. It wasn't just in the kind of far reaches of exotic places. It was in the kind of heartland of Western civilization. Growing economies help to promote democracy, help to promote free markets, help to promote a world where we can engage and be the United States as opposed to have threats to our way of life. So, what motivates me is, I think that the issues we're talking about are issues that are central to what it means to be a great liberal democracy and what it means to be the free market economy that's kind of taught the world how it can do better. And I think we've made a huge amount of progress doing that in the last half century. More people lifted out of poverty in the last 70 years than any other period of human history. And it has helped to make us the most admired country and the country that most want to emulate in the world. And since I think we have a pretty good brand, I think we ought to keep doing it, and I worry deeply if we retreat.
Well, I know that it's very sincere. And as I said at the start, whenever I have called upon Jack to come and visit with us, he has said yes. He came, he's on his way to California via New York and did as a guest to us, came via Washington, D.C. Jack, you are the essence of what it means to devote yourself to the good in the world.
Thank you.
And I heard it today once again, and on behalf of all of us, I thank you for your public service. I hope you continue to speak out, and I hope and I know you will write, and we will all be a benefit of that. So everybody, please join me in thanking Jack Lee.
Thank you.